August 11th, 480 BC. The hot gates aren't a gateway anymore. They're an abattoir. The narrow pass of Thermopylae has become a vertical wall of Persian corpses, stacked so high that fresh waves of attackers must literally climb over mountains of their own dead to reach the Greek spears waiting on the other side. The air is thick with the copper smell of blood and the screams of dying men in a dozen different languages. You're not walking on stone. You're walking on the crushed bodies of immortals, Medes, and Babylonian conscripts, the finest infantry in the known world, now reduced to human scaffolding. This isn't a battle. It's an industrial meat grinder where 200,000 men are being fed into a kill zone, barely wide enough for a chariot, and a force of 7,000 Greeks, led by 300 Spartans, is holding back the tide of an empire that has conquered everything from India to Egypt. History tells us the Spartans died gloriously at Thermopylae. That is true. But it misses the deeper truth. They didn't just die, they weaponized their own deaths. They turned their last stand into a psychological weapon so powerful it would echo for 2,500 years, inspiring every underdog who ever refused to surrender. They proved that sometimes losing a battle is the only way to win a war. To understand how we arrived at this mountain of corpses, we must first understand the monster that created it. When we think of ancient battles, Hollywood has trained us to imagine glorious clashes where heroes fight one-on-one duels and inspire their men with rousing speeches. But war in 480 BC was not about inspiration. It was about resources, terror, and the cold mathematics of logistics. And by every metric that mattered, what happened at Thermopylae should have been over in an afternoon. The Persian army that marched into Greece that summer was not just a military force. It was a moving empire. It was the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history up to that point. Led by King Xerxes, the god-king of Persia, this force numbered somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men, though ancient sources hysterically claim millions. The real number doesn't matter. What matters is that it was so vast that when the army drank from rivers, those rivers ran dry. When they marched, the dust cloud could be seen from 50 miles away. The historian Herodotus, who interviewed survivors and collected first-hand accounts, tells us the Persian army took 7 days and 7 nights to cross the Hellespont on 2 massive pontoon bridges. 7 continuous days of soldiers, cavalry, camels, and supply wagons flowing from Asia into Europe. The logistics alone were staggering. The Persians brought with them camels from Arabia, war elephants from India, and contingents from 46 different nations speaking dozens of languages. There were Ethiopians wrapped in lion skins, Thracians wearing fox fur caps, Assyrians with bronze helmets, and Arabian archers on camels. The supply train alone stretched for miles, laden with gold, siege equipment, and portable palaces, because Xerxes was so certain of victory that he brought furniture for his celebration feast. He brought his entire harem, his personal chefs, and even his wine collection. This wasn't just an invasion. It was a traveling civilization designed to swallow Greece whole and digest it slowly. The Persian Empire in 480 BC was the undisputed superpower of the ancient world. It controlled more territory and more people than any empire in history up to that point. From the Indus Valley in the east to Libya in the west, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Arabia, One man's word was law. That man was Xerxes, and he had a personal vendetta against Greece. 10 years earlier, his father Darius had sent an army to punish the Greeks for supporting a rebellion in Ionia. That army had been defeated at the Battle of Marathon by the Athenians in a shocking upset that humiliated Persia. Darius had died while planning his revenge, and now Xerxes was coming to finish what his father started. But this wasn't just about revenge. This was about the natural order of the world. In the Persian worldview, the great king was appointed by Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, to bring order to chaos. The Greeks, by resisting, were defying the divine order itself. They were chaos incarnate, and they needed to be civilized by force. Xerxes didn't just want to conquer Greece. He wanted to erase the very idea that small, fractious city-states could resist a God-ordained empire. He wanted to make an example so terrifying that no nation would ever dare resist Persia again. The psychological weight of this invasion cannot be overstated. When word reached Greece that Xerxes was coming, many city-states immediately surrendered. They sent earth and water to the great king, the traditional symbols of submission, and hoped for mercy. Some Greek cities actually joined the Persian side, believing resistance was futile. Even the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred religious site in Greece, delivered prophecies of doom, telling the Athenians to flee to the ends of the earth because their city would burn. The oracle told Sparta that either their city would be destroyed or a king would die. The Greeks were not united. They were terrified, divided, and on the brink of collapse before a single Persian soldier had set foot in central Greece. Opposing this juggernaut was King Leonidas, the first of Sparta, a man in his 50s who had been planning for this moment his entire life. His force at Thermopylae consisted of approximately 7,000 Greeks from various city-states, including 300 Spartan warriors, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and contingents from Mycenae, Phlius, Corinth, Arcadia, and other smaller cities. These were not professional soldiers in the modern sense. They were citizen warriors, farmers and craftsmen who picked up shields when their cities called. All except the Spartans. The Spartans were something else entirely. They were weapons forged in childhood, tempered in blood, and sharpened by the single most brutal military training system ever devised. To understand what made the 300 different from every other soldier at Thermopylae, you need to understand what it meant to be Spartan. Sparta was not a normal city-state. It was a military cult that happened to have a city attached. Every aspect of Spartan society was designed for one purpose: to create the perfect warrior. A Spartan boy was taken from his mother at age 7 and subjected to the agogge, a state-sponsored program of systematic starvation, ritual beatings, and survival training, designed to either create a perfect warrior or kill the weak. The boys were given minimal food and encouraged to steal to supplement their rations. If caught stealing, they were beaten, not for stealing, but for being caught, for failing to be clever enough. They slept on beds they made themselves from river reeds. They were taught to endure cold, hunger, and pain without complaint. They were taught to speak in short, cutting phrases that wasted no words. This is where we get the term laconic from Laconia, the region of Sparta. The agoge included ritual fights where boys would beat each other bloody while their elders watched, evaluating their courage. Some boys died during training. This was considered acceptable. The weak were meant to die. Only the strongest, the most cunning, the most ruthless would become full Spartan citizens. When a Spartan reached manhood, he was assigned to a mess unit, a group of 15 men who ate, trained, and fought together. These bonds were stronger than family. A Spartan's loyalty was to his mess first, his city second, and his family a distant third. This is why Leonidas could only bring 300 Spartans to Thermopylae. There was a religious festival happening, the Carneia, during which Spartans were forbidden to march to war. The Spartan government compromised by sending the king with his 300-man royal bodyguard as an advance force, promising to send the full army after the festival. But Leonidas knew the truth. By the time the festival ended, the battle would be over. He was being sent to die, and everyone knew it. That's why he handpicked his 300, specifically from men who had living sons. He was ensuring that every man who followed him could die without ending his family line. This wasn't a military expedition, it was a planned martyrdom. The Spartan military philosophy was built on a simple premise: a citizen's body belonged to the state, not to himself. Running from battle wasn't just cowardly, it was theft. You were stealing state property by preserving a body that was meant to be spent in Sparta's defense. A Spartan mother famously told her son as he left for war, "Come back with your shield or on it." The shield was too heavy to carry if you were running away, so you'd drop it. Carrying your shield meant you'd held your position. Being carried on your shield meant you died in place. There was no third option. Surrender was not just dishonorable, it was literally unthinkable, a concept that didn't exist in the Spartan vocabulary. This mentality produced soldiers who were psychologically incapable of retreat. They could only advance or die. There was no middle ground. If you were a betting man in 480 BC, putting money on the Greeks wasn't a gamble, it was insanity. The Persians outnumbered them 30 to 1, perhaps 50 to 1. They had cavalry, archers, and the Immortals, an elite unit of 10,000 heavy infantry, so named because whenever one fell, he was immediately replaced, maintaining the unit at exactly 10,000 men forever. The Immortals wore scale armor that glittered like fish scales in the sun, carried wickedly curved swords, and had never been defeated in open battle. They were the special forces of the ancient world, drawn from the noble families of Persia and Media. Each immortal was attended by a personal servant who carried his supplies and tended to his needs. They were the most privileged, most elite fighting force on the planet, and they had conquered every enemy they'd ever faced, from the Hindu Kush to the Nile Delta. By contrast, the Greeks had no archers worth mentioning, no cavalry to speak of, and they were exhausted from forced marches north. Most of the Greek soldiers at Thermopylae were middle-aged men, not young athletes. Leonidas himself was in his 50s. These were fathers, craftsmen, and farmers who had left their fields at the height of harvest season to march to their probable deaths. But numbers on a battlefield do not account for geography, and they certainly do not account for men who have decided that dying well is better than living poorly. Leonidas knew he could not defeat the Persian army in an open field. To try would be suicide. So he didn't. He decided to change the battlefield itself. The strategic prize at the center of this collision was Greece itself. But more immediately, it was the narrow pass of Thermopylae, literally the hot gates. named for the thermal springs in the area, where sulphurous hot water bubbled up from deep in the earth. The ancient Greeks believed these springs were the entrance to Hades, which is grimly appropriate given what was about to happen. The pass was the only land route from northern Greece into the heart of the Greek city-states. The Persian army could not bypass it by sea because the Greek navy, though outnumbered, was shadowing the Persian fleet in the nearby straits. If the Persians tried to land troops behind Thermopylae, the Greek ships would attack the landing forces while they were most vulnerable, and the Persian fleet had already been battered by a massive storm that had destroyed hundreds of ships. Xerxes needed to break through on land, and Thermopylae was the gate he had to force open. If the Persians could push through, they would flood into central Greece, burn Athens, destroy Sparta, and end Greek resistance forever. But Thermopylae had a secret weapon built into its geography. At its narrowest point, the pass was barely 15 meters wide, about the width of a modern highway lane, pinched between the steep slopes of Mount Kallidromos on one side and sheer cliffs dropping into the sea on the other. There was simply no room to maneuver, no space for cavalry charges, no way to bring overwhelming numbers to bear. It was the greatest natural bottleneck in the ancient world, a place where terrain nullified numerical superiority. Leonidas looked at this narrow corridor and saw something the Persians couldn't see, the great equalizer. In an open field, 200,000 men would overwhelm 7,000 in minutes. But in a space where only 100 men could fight at once, numbers became irrelevant. The real question was, which 100 men were better? And Leonidas knew the answer to that question. This is where the story shifts from a tale of bravery to a masterclass in defensive warfare. Leonidas didn't just pick a good spot and hope for the best. He engineered the battlefield. When the Greeks arrived at Thermopylae weeks before the Persians, they didn't set up camp and wait. They worked like laborers, not warriors. They rebuilt an ancient Phocian wall that had crumbled over the years, creating a defensive barrier across the narrowest part of the pass. This wasn't a massive fortification. It was only about 3 feet high, built from rough stones. But that was the genius of it. It wasn't meant to stop the Persians. It was meant to slow them, to break up their formations, to force them to climb over it in small groups where they could be killed efficiently, one by one. Behind this wall, the Greeks organized themselves into a killing system that would revolutionize warfare. They would fight in the phalanx formation, 8 rows deep, shields locked together, spears protruding like the quills of a steel porcupine. The phalanx was not a Spartan invention, but the Spartans had perfected it to an art form. Every man in the phalanx had a specific role. The front rank held the line with shields and stabbed with 8-foot spears. The second rank stabbed over the shoulders of the first. The third rank held spears high, creating a canopy of steel that prevented anyone from climbing over. The rear ranks pushed forward, adding their body weight to the mass of the formation, making it as immovable as a stone wall. Breaking a proper phalanx was like trying to punch through a brick wall with your fist. You might hurt the wall, but you were going to destroy your hand in the process. The atmosphere in the Greek camp must have been surreal. Every man there knew they were going to die. There was no ambiguity about this. The oracle at Delphi had already delivered her prophecy to Sparta. Either their city would be destroyed or a king would die. Leonidas had volunteered for death. He had gone to the temple before leaving Sparta and asked the oracle for guidance. The priestess, speaking with the voice of Apollo, had told him that a king of the line of Heracles must die to save Sparta. Leonidas was that king. He knew he was marching to his death, and he did it anyway because that's what the law required. The Spartans believed that law, nomos, was what separated civilization from chaos. A man who died obeying the law died well. A man who lived by breaking it was already dead. So Leonidas marched to Thermopylae not as a suicide mission, but as a legal obligation. He was paying Sparta's debt to the gods with his own life. This wasn't depression or fatalism. It was duty elevated to a religious calling. And his 300 followed him not because they were brainwashed or suicidal, but because they had been raised since childhood to believe that this moment, this test, was the entire purpose of their existence. Everything they had suffered in the Agog, every beating, every cold night, every scar, it was all preparation for this. They were about to find out if the Spartan system actually worked. Meanwhile, the Persian army was approaching like a slow-motion tsunami. The vanguard arrived first, and their scouts rode forward to observe the Greek position. What they saw must have seemed absurd. A few thousand Greeks camped behind a tiny wall that looked like it had been built by children. And in front of that wall, the Spartans were exercising. Some were naked, doing calisthenics in the morning sun, their bronze skin gleaming with oil. Others were combing their long hair, braiding it carefully with flowers and ribbons as if preparing for a wedding or a festival. The Spartans wore their hair long as a mark of pride. Cutting one's hair was a punishment for cowardice. Before battle, they would comb and braid it, a ritual that signified they were preparing to either take a life or give their own. The Persian scouts watched this bizarre display, bewildered. These men were about to face the largest army in the world, and they were grooming themselves like girls getting ready for a dance. The scouts rode back to Xerxes, who was camped several miles away in a golden pavilion so large it required 100 men to set up. They reported what they'd seen, a small Greek force behind a pathetic wall, acting like the battle was a joke. Xerxes summoned Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king who now served as an advisor to the Persian court. Demaratus had been driven from Sparta by his political rivals years earlier and had fled to Persia, offering his services to Xerxes' father. He hated his homeland for exiling him, but he also understood Spartans better than anyone in the Persian camp. Xerxes, lounging on silk cushions, laughed as he heard the scout reports. He turned to Demaratus and asked if this was some kind of joke. Were these Spartans actually insane? Did they not understand that they were about to be crushed by the largest army ever assembled? Why were they combing their hair? Demaratus, knowing he was about to deliver news the king didn't want to hear, chose his words carefully. He replied with words that should have frozen Xerxes' blood. "My lord, when Spartans comb their hair, it means they are preparing to kill or be killed. You are about to fight the finest warriors in Greece, men who compete with each other not over gold or land, but over honor and glory. They will not retreat. They will not surrender. They will stand in that pass and fight until every single one of them is dead. And my king, I fear that even with your vast army, you may not be able to move them." Xerxes didn't believe him. How could he? the god king of Persia, master of millions, conqueror of Egypt and Babylon, defeated by a few hundred barbarians standing in a ditch. It was absurd. It was offensive to the natural order. Demaratus had been driven from Sparta in disgrace. Clearly, he was exaggerating their abilities to make himself seem more valuable as an advisor. Xerxes dismissed the warning with a wave of his hand. He was so confident of victory that he decided to give these stubborn Greeks one more chance to see reason. He sent a herald forward, a man carrying a staff wrapped in white wool, to signal that he came in peace with an offer to negotiate. The herald rode up to the Greek lines and called out for their commander. Leonidas stepped forward, his crimson cloak marking him as king. The herald, speaking in Greek, delivered Xerxes' message with all the diplomatic courtesy required. King Xerxes, Lord of Lords, King of Kings, Master of the four corners of the earth, offers you this choice. Lay down your weapons, and you will be spared. Continue this foolish resistance, and you will be destroyed to the last man. Your cities will be burned. Your women will be enslaved. Your children will be scattered to the winds. The great king is merciful. He gives you this one chance to accept his mercy. What is your answer? The Greek soldiers around Leonidas fell silent, waiting to hear how their king would respond to the ultimatum. Leonidas looked at the herald for a long moment, then delivered a response that has echoed through 2,500 years of history. Two words in Greek that perfectly captured the Spartan philosophy, mollen lab. Come and take them. The herald rode back to Xerxes and delivered the response. The Persian court erupted in outrage. How dare these Greeks insult the great king? Didn't they understand he could bury them in bodies? Xerxes, his face flushed with anger, declared that he would destroy the Greeks so completely that future generations would forget they ever existed. But he didn't order an immediate attack. He was still confident that fear would do the work for him. He decided to wait, to let the Greeks see the full size of his army, to let terror erode their courage. For 4 days, the Persians continued to arrive, contingent after contingent, until the plain before Thermopylae was black with men and horses and camels. The Persians set up camp in full view of the Greeks, making sure the defenders could see the impossibility of their situation. At night, the Persian campfires stretched as far as the eye could see, like a second starry sky laid across the earth. The psychological pressure was immense. Some of the non-Spartan Greeks began to whisper, retreating. They looked at the Persian horde and did the math. They were going to die. Not might die, were going to die. It was simple arithmetic, but the Spartans never wavered. They exercised, they sharpened their weapons, they joked with each other. Herodotus records that one Spartan, when told that the Persian arrows would be so numerous they would blot out the sun, replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." This wasn't bravado. It was a genuine lack of fear born from absolute certainty. The Spartans had made peace with death years ago. They had already died in their minds. Their bodies just hadn't caught up yet. This psychological preparation was their greatest weapon. Meanwhile, Xerxes was growing impatient. He had given the Greeks 4 days to come to their senses. They had not. Their defiance was becoming an embarrassment. If word spread that a handful of Greeks had stared down the great king, and he had done nothing, it would embolden every rebellious province from India to Egypt. His authority depended on the perception of invincibility. These Greeks were threatening that perception simply by continuing to exist. On the fifth day, Xerxes' patience snapped. He ordered the attack. The stage was set for one of history's most asymmetric battles. But before the blood would flow in rivers, both sides would learn a brutal lesson about the difference between quantity and quality. It was the morning of August 17th, 480 BC, and Xerxes had decided to start with a show of overwhelming force to break Greek morale. He didn't send his best troops first. That would have been an admission that he took this threat seriously. Instead, he sent forward 10,000 Medes and Scythians, solid infantry drawn from what is now Iran and the Caucasus, but not his elite forces. These were professional soldiers who had fought in multiple campaigns. They were armored in leather and cloth, carrying wicker shields and short spears designed for close combat. They were brave, experienced, and confident. After all, they outnumbered the Greeks in this first wave alone more than 2-1. Their commanders expected this to be quick. They expected the Greeks to do what every other army did when facing Persian might: negotiate, retreat, or collapse in panic once the killing started. They did not expect what actually happened. As they advanced toward the narrow pass, their officers shouting encouragement, they could see the Greek line ahead. The Spartans had taken position at the rebuilt wall, their bronze shields locked together, their crimson cloaks bright against the gray stone of the mountains. Behind them, the other Greeks waited in reserve. The Medes marched forward in loose formation, the way infantry normally fought in the ancient world, spreading out to use their numbers, staying mobile to dodge projectiles and thrust with spears. But as they entered the narrow pass, something went wrong. The walls of the pass forced them to compress. Men who had been walking shoulder to shoulder with room to maneuver now found themselves squeezed into a tighter and tighter column. They couldn't spread out to flank. They couldn't use their numbers to surround the enemy. The pass was funneling them into a narrow front barely 100 meters wide, and at the narrowest point where the wall stood, it was even smaller. And waiting for them at that choke point, behind the rebuilt Phocian wall, was a solid line of bronze and crimson that did look remotely frightened: the Spartan phalanx. The difference between the two fighting styles was the difference between a mob and a machine. The Medes fought as individuals, skilled warriors, yes, but each man fighting for himself, looking for personal glory and advancement. This was how most ancient armies fought. A battle was a collection of individual duels happening simultaneously. But the Spartans fought as a single organism. They had trained together since childhood. They knew each other's movements, breathing patterns, and instincts better than they knew their own families. Their shields, massive bronze-faced hoplon shields weighing 15 pounds each, overlapped to create an unbroken wall of bronze. Each shield was held on the left arm, protecting both the soldier carrying it and the man to his left. This meant every Spartan was responsible for protecting his brother's life. If you dropped your shield or broke formation, you weren't just endangering yourself, you were killing the man next to you. This created a form of peer pressure more powerful than any officer's command. No Spartan would break ranks because doing so would murder his friends. Their spears, 8 feet long and tipped with iron points, protruded through the gaps at chest height. The front rank knelt slightly, creating a lower wall of spear points. The second rank stood, thrusting over the shoulders of the first, creating a higher layer. The third rank held spears high, deterring anyone from trying to leap over. The result was a wall of bronze and iron that presented no opening, no weak point, no place where an attacker could land a blow without impaling himself on multiple spear points. And crucially, the Spartans moved in perfect synchronization. They had drilled these movements thousands of times since childhood in the agoj. When the command came to advance, they stepped forward as one. When the command came to thrust, 300 spears moved forward in unison, like the pistons of a machine. They had turned warfare from an art into a science, from individual combat into an engineering problem. The Spartans were not better warriors in the sense of being stronger or faster. They were better because they had removed human error from combat. They had created a system where discipline replaced courage, where training replaced improvisation. When the Medes crashed into the Spartan line, it wasn't a battle. It was a lesson in physics. Imagine running full speed into a wall of shields backed by men who have trained their entire lives to hold that exact position. The front rank of Medes simply stopped, crushed against the unmovable bronze wall. The men behind them, unable to see what had happened at the front, kept pushing forward, creating a lethal compression. The Spartans didn't need to be aggressive. They didn't need to attack. They just needed to stand still and thrust their spears forward in rhythm. Thrust, withdraw, thrust, withdraw. Every thrust found flesh. The Medes' wicker shields, designed to be light and maneuverable, were useless against the heavy Greek spears that punched through them like paper. Their short swords, designed for close-in fighting after closing with an enemy, couldn't reach past the 8-foot spears that held them at a distance. The Medes tried to grab the Greek spears and pull them aside, but the Spartans had trained for this. They would allow a Persian to grab the spear shaft, then twist sharply, breaking fingers and wrists before thrusting again. The discipline was inhuman. When a Spartan in the front rank grew tired, he would call out and the man behind him would step forward seamlessly, maintaining the wall without a single gap opening. The rotation was so smooth that the Medes probably never even realized fresh warriors were replacing tired ones. Within minutes, the front ranks of the Persian attack were dead or dying, and the men behind them were tripping over corpses. The narrow pass was becoming clogged with bodies faster than the Persians could drag them away. Blood made the ground slippery. Men lost their footing and fell, only to be trampled by their own comrades pressing forward from behind. The Persians were starting to fight in 3 dimensions, not just against the Greeks in front of them, but against the bodies beneath their feet and the crushing pressure of their own army behind them. But this was just the opening act. The battle had barely begun, and already the Persian commanders were seeing something they had never encountered before. Usually, when you threw 10,000 men at an enemy position, either you broke through or the enemy broke and ran. But the Spartans weren't breaking. They weren't even bending. They stood like a bronze statue, immovable and remorseless, killing with mechanical efficiency. Xerxes, watching from his throne on a hill overlooking the battlefield, couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had brought his golden throne specifically so he could sit in comfort and watch his men crush the Greeks. He had brought scribes to record his victory. He had brought artists to paint the glorious scene. But the scene unfolding before him was not glorious. It was horrific. His Medes, who had conquered nations, were being butchered by a force a fraction of their size. Contemporary accounts say Xerxes leapt from his throne 3 times in anguish as he watched his men die. The first time was when he realized the Greeks weren't running. The second time was when he saw the pile of Persian bodies growing at the wall. The third time was when he saw his Medes break and retreat in disorder, running from the field in terror. 10,000 men had attacked. Perhaps 3,000 were still standing. The rest were dead, wounded, or had thrown down their weapons and fled. And the Greek line hadn't moved an inch, not an inch. The Spartans stood exactly where they had been when the battle started, their shields still locked, their spears still bloody. They hadn't advanced to pursue. They hadn't broken formation. They had simply stood and killed until the Persians stopped coming. Then they had calmly cleaned their weapons and waited for the next wave. But here's what makes the battle even more devastating. The Greeks were rotating fresh troops. Leonidas had divided his force into shifts. While the Spartans held the front line, the Thespians, Thebans, and other Greeks rested in the rear. Every hour, fresh warriors replaced tired ones. The Persians, meanwhile, were feeding exhausted, traumatized men into the same killing zone over and over. It was like trying to drink the ocean. No matter how many men Xerxes sent forward, the pass remained blocked by bronze and corpses. After the Medes failed spectacularly, Xerxes called a conference with his generals. They were shaken. These were men who had fought from India to Libya, and they had never seen anything like this. One general suggested simply waiting the Greeks out, starving them into submission, but Xerxes was livid. He had been insulted. His mercy had been thrown in his face. He wanted blood. He wanted revenge. He wanted the world to see what happened to those who defied the great king. He made a decision that would haunt him. He sent forward the immortals, his elite unit. These were not disposable conscripts. These were the best soldiers in the Persian Empire, the special forces of the ancient world. They had never been defeated. They were recruited from the noble families of Persia and Media. Each immortal wore scale armor that cost more than a common soldier made in a year. They carried short swords of Damascus steel that could cut through iron. They were trained from childhood in the arts of war, taught to fight with spear, sword, bow, and dagger. They were the pride of the Persian army, and they had crushed every enemy they'd ever faced from the Hindu Kush to the Nile Delta. Xerxes watched as his immortals formed up, 10,000 strong, and marched toward the pass. Surely they would break through where the Medes had failed. Surely these elite warriors would show the Greeks what real soldiers looked like. They didn't. The immortals discovered something that would shock military theorists for centuries. In the right terrain, a smaller, better-trained force using superior tactics could defeat a larger, equally brave force through pure tactical superiority. The immortals were brave. They were skilled. They were well equipped. But they suffered from the same problem as the Medes. They were trained to fight in formation in open ground, using mobility and archery to soften an enemy before closing for melee. But in the narrow pass, there was no room for mobility. There was no opportunity to use their bows. By the time they entered the pass, they were too close to the Greek lines to shoot effectively. They were forced to fight hand-to-hand in a space designed to nullify every advantage they possessed. And then the Spartans showed them something new, something terrifying: the feigned retreat. As the immortals pressed forward, pushing hard against the Spartan line, suddenly the Spartans would turn and run. The entire front rank would break and flee in apparent panic, running back toward their own lines in disorder. To the immortals, this looked like victory. It looked like the Greeks had finally broken. They charged forward in pursuit, breaking their own formation as individual warriors raced to be the first to cut down the fleeing enemy. This was the moment Leonidas had trained them for. At a shouted command, the Spartans wheeled around in perfect unison, reformed their phalanx instantly, and slammed into the scattered Persians who had chased them out of position. The immortals, spread out and disorganized, were suddenly facing an organized wall of bronze and spears. They were cut down by the dozens before they even understood what had happened. It was a feigned retreat, perfectly executed, one of the hardest maneuvers in ancient warfare, because it required absolute trust that your comrades would turn with you at the exact right moment. If the timing was off by even a second, if one man turned too early or too late, the entire formation would collapse into real panic. But the Spartans had been practicing this maneuver since they were boys. They could execute it in their sleep. They did it not once, but repeatedly throughout the battle, and every time the Persians fell for it because it looked so convincing. The immortals fell by the hundreds. Their scale armor, designed to stop slashing swords and arrows, was useless against the heavy thrusting spears of the Greek phalanx that punched through the metal scales like a knife through cloth. The narrow pass became so choked with Persian dead that the new waves of attackers had to literally climb over walls of corpses to reach the Greek line. In some places, the bodies were stacked 4 or 5 deep, creating a ghastly barrier of the dead that served as an additional defensive wall. The smell must have been unbearable. Blood and excrement mixed with the sulfur from the hot springs, creating a stench that soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives. The ground was so slippery with blood that men couldn't keep their footing. The Persians were dying not just from spear thrusts, but from slipping on the intestines of their comrades and being trampled to death by the men behind them. Some estimates suggest the Persians lost between 10,000 and 20,000 men in the first 2 days of fighting. The Greeks lost perhaps 1,000, and most of those were from the non-Spartan contingents. The Spartans themselves suffered remarkably few casualties because their armor and training were superior. They wore heavy bronze breastplates that covered their torsos, bronze greaves on their shins, and bronze helmets that protected everything except their eyes and mouth. More importantly, they knew how to fight from behind their shields, exposing as little of their body as possible while maximizing their killing reach. It was a kill ratio that shouldn't have been possible. 20 Persians dead for every Greek. It violated every principle of ancient warfare. Numbers were supposed to matter. Mass was supposed to crush discipline eventually through sheer weight. But it wasn't happening. Xerxes was learning a terrible lesson that would be forgotten and relearned throughout military history. That warfare is not always about who has more men, but about who controls the battlefield geometry. The Persians could bring 200,000 men to Thermopylae, but they could only get 100 into the fight at any moment. The other 199,900 were just standing around waiting their turn to die. By the end of the second day, August 18th, the Persian army was in psychological shock. These were soldiers who had conquered the known world. They had faced Egyptian chariots that could crush a man beneath bronze-reinforced wheels. They had faced Babylonian infantry armed with 7-foot spears and shields as tall as a man. They had faced Indian war elephants that could gore a horse and rider with their tusks, then trample the corpse. Nothing had stopped them. They had burned cities, toppled statues, and sent kings fleeing into the desert. They were the army of the God King, blessed by Ahura Mazda, destined to rule the world. And now a handful of Greeks in a narrow pass had created a wall they couldn't overcome. The morale impact was devastating. Whispers spread through the Persian camp like wildfire. Maybe the Greeks were protected by their gods. Maybe the oracle had blessed these Spartans with invincibility. Maybe this was divine punishment for Xerxes' hubris in trying to conquer Greece. Some Persian soldiers began to refuse orders to attack, claiming illness or injury. The officers had to threaten execution to get men to move forward toward that terrible pass. The smell of death hung over the battlefield, so thickly that it could be smelled for miles. Vultures circled overhead in clouds so thick they really did block out the sun, just as that Spartan soldier had joked. The Persians were not just losing men. They were losing their sense of inevitability, that crucial psychological advantage that made armies surrender before a battle even began. For the first time in this campaign, Persian soldiers were afraid. Xerxes held a war council in his massive tent that night. His generals were at a loss. They had tried frontal assaults. They had sent their best troops. They had attacked at different times of day, hoping to catch the Greeks tired or off guard. Nothing worked. The pass was a killing ground, and the Greeks showed no signs of breaking. The Spartans, incredibly, seemed to be enjoying themselves. Persian scouts reported that between attacks, the Spartans were singing paeans to Apollo and Artemis, war songs that echoed off the mountain walls. They were treating this slaughter like a festival. Some generals suggested simply bypassing Thermopylae by loading the army onto ships and sailing around the pass, landing troops behind the Greek position. But the Persian fleet had been battered by storms and was in no condition for an amphibious assault. Moreover, leaving an enemy army at your back, especially one that was clearly superior in combat, was a fatal strategic error. If the Persian army marched south, this Greek force could attack their supply lines, raid their camps, and create havoc in the rear. No, Thermopylae had to be taken. But how? Others suggested waiting them out, starving them into surrender. The Greeks couldn't have more than a few days of supplies. Eventually, hunger would force them to retreat. But this plan had a fatal flaw: time. Every day that Xerxes sat at Thermopylae doing nothing, his own army consumed its supplies at an astronomical rate. Feeding 200,000 men required hundreds of tons of grain, meat, and water per day. The supply lines stretching back to Asia were already strained. More critically, every day of delay allowed the other Greek city-states to mobilize their armies. Right now, the Greeks were divided and terrified. But if word spread that the mighty Persian army was being held at bay by a tiny force, that fear would transform into hope. More Greek cities would join the resistance. The Greek fleet would gain confidence. Time was not on Xerxes' side. He needed victory, and he needed it soon. The Persian king was trapped in a strategic nightmare of his own making. He had the largest army in the world, but it was useless. He had the best soldiers in the world, but they couldn't reach the enemy. He had more gold than some kingdoms, but he couldn't buy his way past Greek spears. For the first time in his life, Xerxes faced a problem that couldn't be solved by throwing resources at it. But then, as often happens in history, everything changed because of one man's greed. A local Greek named Ephialtes crept into the Persian camp that night, sometime after midnight on August 18th. He was a Malian from the region around Thermopylae, and he knew something that would change the course of the battle, indeed, the course of Western civilization. There was another path. The Anapeia path was a mountain trail that wound up through the hills south of Thermopylae and came down behind the Greek position. It was narrow, treacherous, and difficult to navigate, requiring someone who knew the mountains intimately. But it was passable. If the Persians could get troops up and over that mountain path, they could attack the Greeks from both sides and slaughter them all. Ephialtes knew about this path because he'd grown up in these mountains. He'd hunted deer along that trail. He'd collected herbs there. He knew every switchback and every dangerous drop. And he knew that if he revealed this secret to Xerxes, he would be rewarded beyond his wildest dreams. The great king paid generously for valuable intelligence. Ephialtes could become rich, powerful, respected. All he had to do was betray his fellow Greeks. The name Ephialtes would become synonymous with traitor in Greek culture, used the way we use Judas or Benedict Arnold. But that night, gold was more real to him than honor. He was brought before Xerxes in the royal tent and offered to guide Persian troops along the hidden path in exchange for a reward. Xerxes listened to the traitor and immediately saw the opportunity. He would send his immortals, or what was left of them after 2 days of slaughter, along this mountain path at night. They would attack at dawn from behind, while the main army assaulted from the front. The Greeks would be crushed between two forces. It was perfect. Xerxes gave immediate orders. He dispatched the immortals under the command of Hydarnes, one of his best generals, along with Ephialtes as a guide, to make the night march. Meanwhile, the rest of the army would prepare for one final massive assault at dawn. The trap was set. Leonidas was about to be outmaneuvered not by superior tactics, but by betrayal. That night, the immortals climbed through the darkness, moving single file along the treacherous mountain path. It took them hours. The trail was so narrow in places that a single misstep would send a man tumbling hundreds of feet to his death on the rocks below. They couldn't use torches because the light would alert the Greeks. They moved by moonlight and feel Ephialtes leading the way, Hydarnes and his surviving immortals following in silence. It must have been terrifying. One loose stone, one moment of vertigo, and you'd fall to your death in the darkness. But Hydarnes was patient. He knew that if they could reach the other side by dawn, the battle would be over. They would be heroes, the men who broke the Spartans. High on the mountain, the Phocian Greeks were supposed to be guarding this path. Leonidas had known about the Anapeia Trail. That's why he'd stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers up there specifically to prevent what was about to happen. But the Phocians had grown complacent. They hadn't seen any Persian activity in 2 days. They assumed the Persians were too busy dying at the pass to worry about mountain trails. Most of them were asleep. The sentries were drowsy, cold, and bored. Then, in the pre-dawn darkness, they heard something. The rustle of thousands of feet moving through fallen leaves. The Phocians scrambled to their feet, grabbing weapons and forming up to resist. But they made a fatal error in judgment. Seeing the Persians marching toward them in the darkness, they assumed the immortals were there to attack them specifically, to destroy their force and secure the mountain. So they retreated to a defensive position higher up the mountain to protect themselves, taking up position on rocky ground where they could rain down stones and javelins on attackers trying to climb toward them. It was sound defensive tactics, except for one critical problem. The Persians didn't care about them at all. Hydarnes looked at the Phocians retreating up the mountain and made a quick decision. He could spend hours fighting up rocky slopes to destroy a force that posed no immediate threat, or he could simply march past them and continue down the far side of the mountain toward his real objective, the rear of the Greek position at Thermopylae. He chose the latter. The immortals simply marched past the Phocians, ignoring them completely, and continued down the far side of the mountain toward the Greek camp. The Phocians, realizing their mistake too late, sent runners sprinting down the mountain to warn Leonidas that the Persians had flanked the position. But it was nearly dawn. There was no time left. As the sun rose on the third day, August 19th, 480 BC, Greek scouts came running to Leonidas with devastating news. The Persians were behind them. The mountain path had been compromised. They had perhaps an hour, maybe less, before the immortals descended from the heights and attacked their rear. At the same time, they could see the main Persian army forming up for what looked like a massive assault from the front. The pass was about to be surrounded. This was the moment of truth. Leonidas called an urgent council of war with the other Greek commanders. The situation was absolutely clear. They were about to be trapped between two forces. The only rational choice was to retreat immediately, march south as fast as possible, and try to outrun the Persian flanking force. They had held the pass for 2 days. They had bought valuable time for Greece. They had inflicted catastrophic losses on the Persians. They had done everything that could reasonably be expected. Now they should save themselves to fight another day. The other Greek city-states could field new armies. Athens was evacuating its citizens to the island of Salamis. The Greek navy was preparing for a decisive battle. This didn't have to be the end. There was no shame in retreating from an impossible situation. Every military principle said, withdraw, preserve your force, live to fight another day. But Leonidas made a different calculation. He understood something that transcends tactics and enters the realm of psychology and myth-making. If the entire Greek force retreated now, the Persians would chase them, catch them in the open plains south of the pass, and slaughter them with cavalry. The story would be, the Greeks held for 2 days, but when the Persians got serious, the Greeks ran, and we hunted them down like animals. That was the narrative Xerxes wanted. That was the story that would break Greek morale. But if a force stayed behind and fought to the last man, creating a sacrifice so stunning that poets would sing of it for generations, the story would become, the Spartans held the line while Greece prepared. They died to the last man rather than surrender. They showed us that Persians can be beaten. They showed us that courage matters more than numbers. Myth is more powerful than victory. Martyrdom is more useful than survival. Leonidas made his decision. He ordered the majority of the Greek army to retreat south immediately. The Corinthians, the Arcadians, the Phaeacians, all the contingents from the various city-states. They were to march as fast as possible, spread the word of the battle, and prepare for the next defense. But some Greeks refused to leave. The Thespians, 700 men from a tiny city-state most people had never heard of, refused the order to retreat. Their commander said simply, "We came here to fight beside Spartans. We will not leave them to die alone." It was one of the most heroic decisions in military history, made by men who knew exactly what it meant. The Thespians would be annihilated alongside the Spartans, and their small city might never recover from losing 700 of its citizens. But honor demanded they stay. The Thebans, 400 strong, were ordered to remain as well, though accounts differ on whether they stayed willingly or were held as hostages to ensure Thebes' loyalty to the Greek cause. And the 300 Spartans? They never even considered leaving. This was what they had been created for. Every moment of the agog, every beating, every cold night, every lesson in endurance, it had all been preparation for this exact situation. They were about to validate the entire Spartan system or die trying. Before the final battle began, Leonidas gathered his remaining forces, 1,400 men total, including the Spartans, Thespians, and Thebans, and told them to eat a hearty breakfast. When one of them asked why they should stuff themselves now, Leonidas replied with perfect Spartan brevity, "Because tonight we dine in Hades." It was not bravado. It was not a metaphor. It was a simple statement of fact. By sunset, they would all be dead. This was understood, accepted. The only question was how many Persians they could take with them. As the sun climbed higher, the situation became clear. The immortals were descending from the mountain, moving to attack from the rear. The main Persian army was advancing from the front, and this time they brought everyone. Xerxes was committing his entire force to this final assault. The Greeks abandoned the defensive wall and moved forward into a slightly wider part of the pass where they had more room to maneuver. They were no longer fighting to hold a position. They were fighting to kill as many Persians as possible before they died. This subtle shift in objective changed everything. Before, they had been fighting defensively, letting the Persians come to them. Now they were going on the offensive, and the Spartans unleashed a controlled fury that the Persians had not seen before. What followed was perhaps the most savage close-quarters combat in ancient history. Combat so intense that it would be talked about in hushed tones around campfires for generations. The Greeks fought with spears until the wooden shaft shattered from repeated impacts. Then they drew their short swords, the xiphos, leaf-shaped blades about 2 feet long designed for close-in stabbing, and continued fighting, stepping over mounds of corpses to reach fresh enemies. When the swords broke or were knocked from their hands, they fought with their shields, using the heavy bronze rims as bludgeons to crush Persian skulls and break Persian jaws. When they lost their shields, they fought with their bare hands, grappling with Persians and using their superior strength and training to break necks and throw men onto their comrades' spears. They bit, they scratched, they kicked, they used rocks, they used the bodies of dead Persians as clubs. This wasn't war as the Persians understood it. This was something primal and terrifying. Men who had crossed over into a state beyond fear or reason. The accounts tell us that the Spartans fought with such demonic ferocity that the Persians began to refuse to close with them hand to hand. Persian officers had to literally whip their men forward with actual whips, and even then the soldiers would only get so close before retreating. The Persians resorted to using their spears as lances, thrusting from maximum range and immediately stepping back, before the Greeks could grab the spear shaft. Eventually, the Persian commanders made a tactical decision. Stop trying to fight these monsters in melee. Just kill them from a distance. They pulled their frontline troops back and brought forward thousands of archers. They formed a shooting line and began firing arrows in volleys, wave after wave of missiles arcing through the air. The Greeks, exhausted and wounded, formed up with their shields overhead, creating a testudo or turtle formation to protect themselves. But they had been fighting for hours. They were tired. The shield wall had gaps. Arrows found flesh. Leonidas himself was at the front of his men when he was hit. Multiple arrows struck the Spartan king, and he fell. His death should have been the end of the Greek resistance. In most armies, when the king dies, the soldiers break and run. But these were Spartans. Leonidas falling didn't cause retreat, it caused rage. The body of a Spartan king was sacred. It could not be left to the enemy to desecrate. The remaining Spartans formed up around their fallen king and fought with even greater fury to recover his body. 4 times they drove the Persians back and pulled Leonidas's corpse toward their own lines. 4 times the Persians, desperate to capture this trophy, pushed forward again to try to seize it. The fighting over Leonidas's body was so intense that ancient sources describe it as the fiercest combat of the entire 3-day battle. Finally, as the Greeks were pushed back by sheer numbers and exhaustion, they formed a final defensive circle on a small hill within the pass. This hill still exists today, a small mound that now has a monument on it. The Spartans and Thespians dragged themselves up that hill, many of them wounded multiple times, all of them exhausted beyond anything they'd ever experienced. They had no weapons left except broken swords and shattered spear shafts. Some men fought with their bare hands, and they formed a circle, shields locked, facing outward in all directions as Persians surrounded them completely. The Persians, having learned over 3 days to fear closing with these men, did not attack directly. They stood back at a safe distance and simply fired arrows until every Greek was dead. The last Spartans died with their shields locked together, forming a wall even in death. When it was finally over, when the last Greek had fallen, the Persians cautiously approached the hill of corpses. What they found there chilled them more than the battle itself. The Greeks had died in formation. Even at the end, even when they could have scattered and tried to save themselves, even when their king was dead and their cause was lost, they had maintained their discipline. They had died as a unit, as brothers, shields locked until their final breath. It was the most terrifying thing the Persians had ever seen, because it demonstrated something they couldn't comprehend, a commitment to duty so absolute that it transcended self-preservation. Xerxes, when he finally walked through the pass and saw the carnage, was reportedly both awed and horrified. The entire length of the pass was carpeted with Persian dead. Estimates of Persian casualties at Thermopylae range from 10,000 to 20,000 men killed over 3 days, though some ancient sources claim even higher numbers. The Greeks had lost approximately 4,000 total, including those who retreated and those who died. But that number is misleading. What really matters is that Xerxes had won the battle. The pass was open. The road to Athens was clear. But it had cost him 7 days and the cream of his army to kill 1,400 Greeks. And those Greeks had become something far more dangerous than a military obstacle. They had become a legend that would haunt the Persian campaign. In his rage and humiliation, Xerxes did something that would stain his reputation forever. He ordered his men to search through the Greek dead and identify the body of Leonidas. When they found the Spartan king, Xerxes ordered his soldiers to behead the corpse and mount the head on a stake. He also ordered the body to be crucified, hung on a wooden cross as an insult and warning. It was meant as the ultimate dishonor, a display of dominance over the man who had humiliated him. But it backfired spectacularly. In Greek culture, desecrating a corpse was the act of a barbarian, of someone who feared the dead man even after death. You don't mutilate the body of a worthless enemy. You only mutilate the body of someone who terrified you, someone whose power you need to destroy symbolically because you couldn't destroy it in life. By desecrating Leonidas, Xerxes admitted that the Spartan king had defeated him psychologically, even while losing militarily. The message that spread through Greece wasn't Xerxes is so powerful he can do what he wants. The message was Xerxes feared Leonidas so much he had to mutilate his corpse. It became the ultimate propaganda victory for the Greeks, a gift handed to them by Persian rage. With Thermopylae in Persian hands, Xerxes marched south toward Athens. The population of Athens had already evacuated to the island of Salamis and other nearby locations, taking with them everything portable. When the Persians arrived, they found an empty city. Xerxes ordered it burned to the ground. The Acropolis was destroyed, the temples were looted, and the city was left in ruins. For a moment, standing in the ashes of Athens, Xerxes must have felt victorious. He had crushed the Greek army at Thermopylae. He had burned their most famous city. Surely now the Greeks would surrender. But the delay at Thermopylae had changed everything in ways Xerxes didn't fully understand yet. Those 7 days had given the Greek city-states time to evacuate Athens, time to concentrate their navies, time to build more ships, and most importantly, time to overcome their fear. Before Thermopylae, many Greeks believed resistance was futile. The Persians were invincible. They had conquered everything from India to Egypt. How could small divided Greek city-states hope to stand against them? But Thermopylae proved that Persians could bleed. The Spartans had shown that with the right tactics and the right terrain, a smaller force could inflict catastrophic casualties on a larger one. The story of the 300 spread like wildfire through Greece, growing with each retelling. Soldiers who had been ready to surrender heard about men who chose death over submission, and they found their courage. Weeks later, in late September of 480 BC, the Greek and Persian fleets met in the narrow straits of Salamis. The Greek commander, Themistocles, had learned the lesson of Thermopylae. Force the enemy to fight in a confined space where numbers don't matter. He lured the Persian fleet into the narrow waters where the Greek ships, though outnumbered, could engage on equal terms. Xerxes sat on a golden throne on a hill overlooking the straits, just as he had at Thermopylae, confident of victory. He watched as his fleet rode into the straits. Then he watched as the Greek navy, inspired by the sacrifice at Thermopylae, destroyed his fleet in a brutal naval battle. The Persian ships, too many and too crowded in the narrow waters, collided with each other. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't use their numbers. It was Thermopylae on water. Xerxes, watching from his throne as hundreds of his ships burned and sank, realized he had lost. The Greek navy had survived. His supply lines were cut. His army, still in Greece, was now isolated and vulnerable. The god king of Persia, master of millions, had been defeated by tactics learned from 300 Spartans who died in a narrow pass. Xerxes retreated to Persia, leaving behind an army under his general Mardonius. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the full Spartan army arrived. 10,000 Spartan hoplites and 30,000 allies. They destroyed the remaining Persian army in a battle so one-sided it was almost a massacre. The Persians were routed, Mardonius was killed, and the surviving Persians fled back to Asia. The impossible had happened. Greece had survived. The Spartans at Thermopylae didn't win the war by killing Persians. They won it by dying in such a way that every Greek who heard the story felt ashamed to do anything less than fight with everything they had. The poet Simonides, one of the greatest lyric poets of ancient Greece, was commissioned to write an epitaph for the Spartan dead. He composed what may be the most famous military epitaph ever written, carved into a stone at the battlefield. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. There's a cold, almost bureaucratic tone to those words that perfectly captures the Spartan mentality. They didn't die for glory, though glory came. They didn't die for riches, for they had none. They didn't die for personal ambition or fame. They died because the law of Sparta required it, and they obeyed. The word obedient is crucial. It emphasizes that this was duty, not passion, obligation, not choice. In a culture that valued individual freedom, the Spartans were saying, "We are not free. We belong to the state. Our bodies are not our own. We die when and where the law demands, without question or complaint." But the impact of Thermopylae went far beyond the immediate military situation. For 2,500 years, the story has been retold, adapted, and invoked whenever a small force faces impossible odds. When 189 Texan defenders died at the Alamo in 1836, facing thousands of Mexican soldiers, the parallel to Thermopylae was immediately drawn. When 150 British soldiers held Rorke's Drift against 4,000 Zulu warriors in 1879, they compared themselves to the 300. In World War II, when Allied forces were surrounded and outnumbered at places like Bastogne or Tobruk, commanders would invoke the Spartans to inspire their men. The story transcends culture, language, and time because it speaks to something fundamental in human psychology. Why does then battle, a defeat by any military metric, resonate so deeply across cultures and centuries? Why do we remember the losers at Thermopylae better than the winners at 100 other battles? Because Thermopylae teaches us something fundamental about human nature, that how you lose matters as much as whether you win. The Spartans could have retreated when they learned about the mountain path. They would have been tactically justified. Every military manual would have endorsed the decision. They had held the pass for 2 days, inflicted massive casualties, and bought valuable time. Mission accomplished. Time to go. But by choosing to stand, by choosing to die in a way that was beautiful and terrible and absolute, they created a story that was worth more than 1,000 victories. They weaponized their own deaths. They turned mortality into mythology. They proved that sometimes symbolic victories matter more than tactical ones. The lesson of Thermopylae is not that you should throw your life away for nothing. It's not glorifying meaningless death. It's something more subtle. Sometimes the act of resistance, even doomed resistance, even hopeless resistance, changes everything. The Spartans didn't believe they could kill 200,000 Persians with 300 men. That would have been insane. But they believed that their sacrifice, done in the right way at the right time, would light a fire in Greek hearts that couldn't be extinguished. They believed that dying well was a form of propaganda, a weapon that would inspire others to fight harder than they thought possible, and they were absolutely right. Every Greek soldier who fought at Salamis, at Plataea, at Mycale, fought with the ghosts of the 300 looking over their shoulders, demanding that they be worthy of such a sacrifice. Today, if you visit Thermopylae, you won't find the narrow pass of legend. Over 2,500 years, the river deposits from the Spercheios River have pushed the coastline miles to the east. The battlefield is now landlocked farmland, peaceful and quiet, with a highway running through it. The hot springs that gave the place its name are still there, still bubbling with sulphurous water, but the dramatic geography that made the battle possible is gone, buried under centuries of sediment. Standing guard over that silence is a bronze statue of Leonidas, created in 1955. He's mounted on a stone pedestal, shield in hand, facing north toward where the Persians came. His helmet is pushed back, showing his face, stern, determined, unafraid. At the base of the statue is Simonides' epitaph, still readable in Greek after 2.5 millennia, reminding every visitor of what happened on this spot. And every year, thousands of people from around the world visit that spot, not to celebrate victory, but to honor the beauty of a perfect sacrifice. Looking at that statue, it's easy to fall into romantic nostalgia, to think that the Spartans were superhuman or that the battle was won by pure courage. But that does a disservice to what actually happened there. The lesson of Thermopylae is not about mystical warrior spirit or supernatural toughness. It's about cold, calculating strategy combined with absolute commitment. Leonidas didn't delay Xerxes because he was braver than other men. He delayed Xerxes because he understood force multiplication through terrain, because he engineered a battlefield where quality trumped quantity, and because he was willing to pay the ultimate price to buy time for his nation. It was a master class in defensive warfare and asymmetric tactics that is still studied in military academies worldwide. West Point teaches Thermopylae. Sandhurst teaches Thermopylae. Every serious military academy on Earth uses this battle as a case study in how to fight when outnumbered. The lessons are clear. Terrain matters more than numbers. Discipline beats bravery. Defense is easier than offense. Psychological warfare is as important as physical warfare. And sometimes, dying in the right way at the right time is the most effective form of resistance. It teaches us that when David fights Goliath, David doesn't win by matching Goliath's strength. That's suicide. David wins by changing the rules of engagement, by finding the one place where Goliath's advantages become liabilities, and by forcing Goliath to fight on David's terms. The Battle of Thermopylae remains one of history's most influential defeats. It didn't just delay an invasion for a few days. It forged a narrative of resistance that has inspired every underdog battle since. From the defense of Malta to the siege of Bastogne, from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising to the protests in Tiananmen Square, whenever humans have stood against overwhelming force, they have drawn strength from the memory of those 300 Spartans who stood in a narrow pass and refused to move. The Spartans proved that surrender is a choice, not an inevitability. That sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to lose on someone else's terms. So the next time you face a challenge that seems insurmountable, whether it's a corporate giant, an unjust system, corrupt authority, or simply the crushing weight of circumstances, remember Thermopylae. Remember that you don't need overwhelming force to make a stand that matters. You just need to find your narrow pass, that place where your opponent's advantages become irrelevant, and hold that ground with everything you have. Sometimes you don't need to win. You just need to make them pay such a terrible price for victory that the world remembers how you lost rather than celebrating how they won. Sometimes standing and fighting, even when you know you'll lose, is the only way to ensure that your cause will win eventually. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change history. The 300 Spartans died at Thermopylae on August 19, 480 BC. But Sparta lived on for another 600 years. Xerxes won the battle but lost the war and returned home in disgrace. The Persian Empire never again attempted to conquer Greece, and 2,500 years later, we still remember the names of men like Leonidas, while the names of millions who served the Persian Empire have been lost to time. We remember because they chose to make their deaths meaningful. Because in the end, history doesn't belong to those who have the most resources or the biggest armies or the most advanced technology. History belongs to those who refuse to surrender what matters most, regardless of the cost. History belongs to those who understand that some things, freedom, honor, duty, brotherhood, are worth dying for. And when you die for those things in a way that inspires others to carry on your fight, you don't really die at all. You become immortal. If you've made it this far in this story, thank you for taking this journey through one of history's most analyzed and most inspiring last stands. Hit that like button to help us hold our own line against the algorithm, and subscribe to see how other impossible stands change the course of civilization. Until then, remember the words of Leonidas, Mollen Leib. Come and take them, because sometimes the only response to overwhelming force is 2 words of defiance that echo through eternity.